Kevin, thanks for chatting with us today. I know you have dealt with this issue and have talked to a lot of folks. And so, from your perspective, from a counseling perspective, what are we talking about when we talk about anxiety?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the things that's helpful is to be able to distinguish the difference between stress and anxiety. Now, they're both similar and they both have emotional responses, but with stress, it tends to be like this external factor, like a work deadline or maybe a fight with a spouse. Or that dreaded phone call of like, hey, son, we're in town and we're going to be at your house in 10 minutes.
Yep.
That creates stress. And stress is then kind of like this rubber band where when it gets stretched, we feel the tension and maybe it creates a little bit of irritability. Maybe it creates some problems sleeping. Maybe it just causes problems with our functioning a little bit. Anxiety, on the other hand, is much more of like an internal conflict, and it has to do with excessive worries. And when we take the rubber band now and we stretch it, it no longer is able to serve the purpose that it once did, and it interferes with our daily functioning. So what was once a little bit of irritability is now like fits of rage. What was difficulty falling asleep is now an inability to sleep. And that's really the difference between stress and anxiety. Where stress, we're still able to function. We can go back to normal when that argument has been resolved or that work deadline has been met or my parents leave the house. We go back to normal, but with anxiety, we remain in this place where we're just not able to function daily.
Man. So, what are the consequences of that, for instance?
So many people, when they experience that type of anxiety, that excessive worry, it can actually lead to like a lot of muscle tension, which will lead to some headaches, body aches and pains, difficulty with digestion, and just when they lay down to sleep, they just cannot relax. And it ends up creating this negative feedback loop where the more that they worry, the more they're unable to rest, and it just creates this cycle they remain in for a while.
Makes total sense. So, would you say, I know you and I have talked about this, but there are certainly different types of anxiety.
There are several different types of anxiety. There are two that are the most common. So generalized anxiety is the one that I would say is this. Panic disorder is the other one that I hear a lot about. Now with panic, it's different in that it's completely unexpected. It comes from nowhere, and there's this flood of fear that just washes over people. And they tell me that their heart races, they have problems breathing, they break out into a sweat, they get sick to their stomach. This can last 10 to 20 minutes, and ultimately they just have this overwhelming feeling that they are going to die. So in that, they're afraid to even go out because they're afraid that it's going to happen while they're out, and again, it just leads to this place of where they're unable to function in daily life.
So, Kevin, how would you put into context the last 12 months as we're dealing with the pandemic and navigating this issue?
Yeah, even before the pandemic, anxiety, 20% of American adults would experience some type of anxiety in a given year, with 31% experiencing anxiety in the course of their lifetime. Since the pandemic, there's been a 5% increase overall. So what we're looking at is anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 of the general population will experience some type of anxiety that creates problems with their daily life.
That's a lot.
That's a lot.
So for our families, this is creating quite the impact. How would you describe that?
Absolutely. If there's one person within the family that's experiencing anxiety, what statistics have shown us in the past is that 34% of Americans and 40% of church-going Christians say that either anxiety or depression significantly interferes with their relationship satisfaction. So now with this increase of anxiety that's happening, there's been an increase as well in the divorce rate, showing about 34% of Americans are now finding themselves in some type of divorce case. So the pandemic itself is having an effect on relationship satisfaction for sure.
So certainly we're talking about families, but even beyond that, the younger generation, singles, there's a significance there too.
Absolutely. So already our adolescents and our youth, it had been said that prior to the pandemic, the amount of anxiety that they were experiencing was greater than that of the acute psychiatric population in the 1960s. So what that means is that the anxiety that our kids are experiencing would have them hospitalized just 50, 60 years ago. Now, with social isolation, with quarantining, with what they've already expressed as their desire for connection and their fear of loneliness, that we're only exasperating the problem, and I see the numbers will more than likely grow exponentially.
That makes sense. Well, I know your heart is to counsel from a biblical center, and that's why I love what you do. There's obviously this meshing of the spiritual and physical world when it comes to this issue of anxiety. How would you describe that?
Yeah, I believe the way that we think actually is the spiritual battleground. And I think most of us can acknowledge that there are times that we get kind of negative in our thinking and our thinking becomes stinking, right? So we live in this culture that's kind of fear-based in a lot of ways, and we buy into the belief that the sky truly is falling. But our anxiety then ends up getting rooted into fear and into a desire for control and the what ifs. Like, what if this outfit makes me look big? What if the words that I'm speaking are offensive to someone? What if, because of what I'm saying, people don't like me? And it's these what ifs then that really begin to make the seed of doubt. And we know in Scripture, James says that the man who doubts is unstable in all he does. And I believe we're starting to see a lot of the fruit of that in the instability of our society.
So, as a Christ follower, how would you say, man, this is the best way to navigate that?
I think it would be good to be able to consider life into three distinctive compartments. So I'm going to use these just as demonstrations. So this first compartment is the compartment of which we have control. The second is the compartment that we have influence. And the third is the compartment that we have no control. And what I see happening more often than not is people trying to live out of this pot. They have no control, but they're trying to control everyone and everything. And when they do so, what they begin to experience is more and more anxiety. But really, what needs to happen, if possible, because we know that, and I even hate saying some of these things, but like natural disasters are going to happen. Global pandemics may continue. The things that we didn't see coming will come. And when they do, if we try to live out of this, we're going to continue experiencing anxiety. But if we can put these aside and surrender them to the sovereignty of God and live out of this, this represents the parts that we can control. And this is the part that we want to live in.
So you're saying this is the bowl we have control of. Explain that.
Oh, I'd love to. So let's look at Scripture just a little bit here, right? Where in the Gospel of John, Jesus says, do not let your hearts be troubled. Now, the heart includes the way that we think. And if we pay a close attention to what Jesus is saying, he's saying, do not let your thoughts be troubled. So then we jump ahead a little bit to Colossians 3, and we're listening to Paul, and he uses some of the same words. He says, let the peace of Christ rule your hearts. Again, our hearts, the way that we think. He says that we can actually let the peace of Christ rule our thoughts. So do I choose to live in a world and think of trouble, or do I choose to control what I can think and live in a state of peace? So as we continue then into Philippians 4, this is where I always like to take people as we're talking about anxiety, because Paul tells us then to be anxious about nothing, right? But with everything. So when the things that we didn't see coming come, when that happens, be anxious for nothing, but with everything. Like, give thanks to God for that. And when we do, there's a peace that comes that we don't even understand, but it begins to guard our hearts and our minds the way that we think. And then from that place, we can start thinking about the things that are true, thinking about the things that are noble, thinking about the things that are pure and are lovely and are exceptional and admirable. And when we live in that, and when we think from that place, our minds actually get renewed into the image of the Creator, where there is no fear. There's only love and peace.
That's good. Kevin, thanks a ton. I know this is a big issue, and we're going to keep tackling it.
Yeah.
But man, thanks for sharing your heart, especially from what God is teaching you and from your expertise and what you're able to use for the kingdom. So appreciate it.
Thank you.